you ready, Derek? I am. Then we will return together. All the nurses at the hospital were very friendly. Their clip on smiles and forced enthusiasm made for an enjoyable experience, even though all their nice greetings felt like overtaught routine duties. I enjoyed my stay there, though it wasn't long at all. The moment I had regained conscience, my sister had brought me home, after nodding her head frantically in acknowledgement of what the clipboard wielding doctor was reading off of the paper before him. It was clear everything he was telling her was way over her head, but I caught the gist of it. Having suffered no physical injury, or that of which the medical professionals could diagnose, they said I had undergone some form of mental recession due to a traumatic experience. They tried backing this up by throwing about lengthy terms and ratios that evidently made their hypothesis accurate in the most overwhelming sense. It was unfortunate for them that they were still wrong, even with their liberally applied wide array of vocabulary. I didn't know what happened to David, nor was I willing to ask. I was unconscious for only a few hours, but my journey outside the body felt like decades, and to recall the event that had occurred so long ago was a difficulty I was not willing to ensure. A legality issue had occurred which involved my father, but his abstract and unwilling intent to become involved in matters of potential importance had him hand over the subject to my sister, who dropped the charges that could have been pressed against David for his physical assault against the minor. She wanted nothing more to do with him, and I was thankful for that. Returning to life for me was a joy, as I forgot the overwhelming sensations that accompanied living in this reality. I was still officially on suspension, so I spent the remainder of my days indulging in the activities I enjoyed so much. These hobbies would consist of daily swimming in the chlorinated waters of my backyard pool, followed by drying off on the delicate fabrics of the living room couch and baking brain cells over the animated figures dancing on the television screen. Kristen never said anything about her earlier declaration of keeping me confined to my room for the duration of my suspension. She also never said anything about the event involving her boyfriend and myself. In fact, she rarely said anything for the remainder of that week. It was as though she didn't exactly know what to say to me after all that. But as the days went on, we slowly returned to our traditional habits of pestering one another and growing aggravated over each other's annoying tendencies. In other words, we became siblings again. Dylan never came by for a second time during the week, as I was sure his mother expected me to be in trouble during my suspension and thus restrained him from coming over to play. My sister also spent a lot of time to herself, as she no longer hosted late night parties at the house, which she was previously growing too fond of. She didn't even bring over another boy, which I was perfectly fine with, and even when her girlfriends came over, they did so one at a time and not en masse, as what had been occurring over the days previous to my scuffle with David. It had been a quiet end of the week, but I wasn't going to allow that to remain during my return to school. I settled snugly into my secure seat before looking off to my sides in mysterious wonder. When things looked still and fine, I threw a shoulder into Dylan. "Move over," I shouted. "I can't." "I'm almost out the window," Dylan shouted back. We were laughing as we kicked and shoved in a playful manner before Grover, the bus driver, began yelling out post-nom emergency codes over the bus's PA system. Nobody knew what he was saying, but the bus was picking up speed, and each turn in the road caused kids to launch out of their seats into the middle aisle as their backpacks were flung like rocket-propelled projectiles. "Landmines coming!" Grover yelled as the back end of the bus was thrown into the air from the potholes in the road, and the kids in the center aisles were all tossed into the air at once, before coming back down hard onto the pile of school bags that were scattered about. This was probably my favorite of having to go to school every day. I always could rely on old Grover to take a detour that would put the bus through an axle-bending, shock-impacting, and tire-popping adventure that would exhaust the onboard students at the same rate the gas tank was leaking fuel. After throwing Dylan's rolling body off of me, I climbed back onto the seat quickly and clasped onto the bottom cushion, waiting for the next turn, bump, or barrel roll the bus would undergo. The tension was thrilling, and being at the back of the bus, I had no clear view of the front window, or what was to come for that matter. "Clear skies from here, boys," shouted Grover, looking back over his shoulder for a second to see how many of his occupants were still alive. All the students on board let out a group sigh as kids slowly climbed from the ground and back into the stiff leathered seats. I let go of the grip I had on the bar below my seat and looked over to Dylan, who was busy staring out of the corner of his eye at a student a few seats across from us. Without even following his eye, I knew who he was looking at. You think he's mad that we're still in his seat?" Dylan asked as he kept his eyes locked on the 8th grader a few seats ahead. Whatever, it's our seat now, I responded. I couldn't find any dread or anger from the school fight that landed me in a week's suspension, but I assumed it was there, and I didn't linger long in the unusual, tranquil mind of the bully. Dylan's attention averted elsewhere, and he reached into his pocket to pull out a piece of paper that was folded into numerous squares. It was the class schedule that we were issued on the first day of school, and instead of committing it to memory like every grade A student, we carried them around with us for what will probably be for the entire year. Here, let me see yours, Dylan asked. Unlike Dylan's neatly folded schedule, I produced a crumpled ball of paper from the bottom pits of my pocket, complete with torn corners and tattered edges that nearly ripped in half as I tried unfolding it. I threw it onto his lap before I degraded its condition even further and watched as he held both sheets side by side and observed them intently. Oh, Dylan exclaimed. We have gym together. The two of us jumped out of our seat with excitement and threw out brimming high fives just as the bus came to a halting stop and our bodies lunged into the seat before us. Get your jabbing gob-nabbing hind tushies off my deck pronto, Grover shouted over the back of the bus as he kicked the door lever with his foot and waved his hand in a frantic evacuation gesture towards the parting doors. It was time for school. Mrs. Peterson must have had a doctorate degree in boredom because she had a profound talent in making every minute of her class pass by the rate of an hour. She continued to scribble numbers, shapes, and symbols on the blackboard without care that the chalk she applied roughly to the board in front of her had powdered into the air and gently deposited into her hair. It made for a rather vivid display of what long-term neglected dandruff would have looked like. I was busy passing time by placing the length of my index finger into the right nostril passage of my nose, and I would not stop until I could feel the sticky residue of a gigantic booger clinging to the front of it. This ending, however, did not happen, and I grew in disappointment as my finger returned to me without any newfound prizes. It seemed the long and lengthy hours of Mrs. Peterson's class had caused me to retrieve every possible residual substance within my nose, as I could find nothing worthy of picking. Ew, shouted the girl to my side, who showed the most distressed expression of disgust I had ever seen. I returned the same look to her as she scrunched her eyes in a state of distress, as though I was forcing her to watch my nose-picking session. Had I a lob-worthy booger at the end of my finger, I would have generously flicked it into her direction. Is there something wrong, Catherine? Mrs. Peterson asked in aggravation, offended at the interruption from her lesson plan. The teacher's pet turned to Mrs. Peterson before speaking. Derek was just Shut up. The girl went quiet. Her teeth clenched down as though keeping a well-guarded secret. Derek did what? After realizing she wasn't going to get an answer from the girl, Mrs. Peterson turned to me. Derek, what did you do? Nothing, I said aloud. I did nothing. Mrs. Peterson turned back to the blackboard and picked up right where she had left off, which was applying another new coat of yellow chalk dust to her formal dress shirt. A nerve vessel had imploded in her left cerebral cortex of her brain when someone had opened her classroom door and walked in on the midst of her lesson. Yes? She asked, tilted her head down so that her glasses would slide to the end of her nose, allowing a clear, unhindered view of the person who entered her classroom. The thin, blonde-haired, young adult office lady walked her tall and narrow frame through the doorway before she looked out into the classroom without answering Mrs. Peterson. Her eyes locked with mine for a brief second. I would like to borrow Derek for a moment, she said to Mrs. Peterson, already buying the patience of the classroom head. It was asked like a request, but had the force of a demand, and Mrs. Peterson, though her blood boiled in irritation, she knew it was beyond her power to deny it. Looking out to the room, Mrs. Peterson found me with predetermined ease, as she was continually looking in my direction for trouble. She gave me a quick head nod, which told me that I had little choice but to follow this overdressed office junkie. Mrs. Peterson then returned, for the third time, back to the blackboard, where she tried to finish her explanation of the hypotenuse triangle. The woman who had requested my presence had backed her way towards the door so that she'd be out of the way of the classroom. She had remained there in a stillness only replicated by that of a robot until I got up and walked my way to her. She watched me the entire way, up with one hand neatly folded over the other. She reminded me of the governmental agents in most theatrical movies, the ones who's pursuing the protagonist with the intent to pry valuable information from their innocent minds. It wasn't comforting when I found out that was exactly what she had planned, and her sinister stare made every step across the room the most uncomfortable experience. It wasn't just her, as every student in the room looked on curiously as I walked in her direction. Some students leaned over and whispered into their neighbors' ears. Others just averted attention between Mrs. Peterson and I, trying to disguise the fact that they were staring like the rest. It was all obvious to me, and every one of them had wondered the very same thing. What did Derek do this time? Her office was like that of any overpaid faculty member who had enough leisure time to position the photo album of her family and friends across the edge of her luxury glass desk. Though books and papers littered the corners of her room, it was clear that none of them were ever used more than to play the role of ambient backdrop suggestions that deceived onlookers into believing that the occupant of this chamber may be one of potential intelligence. The neat and mechanical way in which she sat in her chair, crossed her legs, placed the tips of her fingers at the edge of her desk, and then turned to me in a precisely executed 45-degree turn, suggested she was void of any human emotion. I would have just as quickly mistaken her for an android if I wasn't capable of hearing her arithmetic thoughts that reminded her of how to execute these precise practiced movements. "Please take a seat," she said to me as she turned her palm upright in the direction of a chair that was pre-positioned to face her. The seat, much like her own, was angled precisely at a degree that suggested attention was to be between the two of us, but not entirely enclosed as to impose a sense of captivity. As I looked around the room, I came to realize everything around me took a similar approach. Even her photo album wasn't out just for her entertainment. It was to suggest that she was a laid-back family woman who was very open to people's suggestions, and like everyone else, a human being. For her to assume an 11-year-old boy who would come to these suggestions in a passive subconscious registration made me realize this woman was overqualified for her position here at Keller Middle School, and had never intended to deal with children in her career path. I sat there in that chair in silence, registering all the objects around the room. My eyes were looking curiously about as she sat there in her own chair, which, by the way, looked far more comfortable than mine, and she stared at me in the same silence as she had planned before bringing me into the room. Her experience in the field told her to watch her patient before beginning discussion, and her mind spoke aloud to herself, suggesting that my jumpy attention and shifty eyes was a clear indication of nervousness. At that assumption, I averted my eyes to hers. I was not nervous, and I felt like making that clear. I threw a look of irritation on my face, and leaned back in the chair, crossing my arms as though I felt my time was being wasted. She still refused to say anything, and instead her eyes surfed down to my arms once again. Her academic mind set voiced loudly that my closed-arm gesture meant I was going to be unwilling to give up information, and that I found the entire experience discomforting. I separated my arms, growing ever greater in irritation. The woman's over-analyzing of everything was quickly getting to me, and if she was going to be like this the entire time, then I was not going to refrain from playing my own game. "Say something." "Derek," she began. "I'm Miss Kendleton, but I would like for you to call me Kathy. Here in my office, I want you to be as comfortable as possible. I don't want you to think of this as school, just a place where you can speak your thoughts." I felt like pointing it out to her how bad she had already failed at all that, but I let her continue anyways. "Is that all right with you?" "I guess," I said, shrugging at her question. It was my way of saying I wasn't too fond of her introduction. "Did you do anything fun over the weekend?" she asked, looking up and down my body for gestures that she was trained on recognizing. I knew she really didn't care to hear about my weekend, just that it was a nice way of easing me into conversation. To answer her question, oh yeah, I did. Are you kidding me? Not only did I play the most intense game of Mortal Kombat, eat the largest sum of potato chips, and waterlogged my flesh into the coldest waters of my pool, I managed to honk the living room television set all to myself, thanks to my sister's remorse from having allowed her boyfriend to nearly kill me. Of course, I told her none of that. Instead, I just shrugged. "You don't know? Do you remember anything from your weekend?" "No, actually I fell to amnesia over the past few days and spent my days wandering down busy city streets, asking strangers if they recall my face. The woman's extortion tactics were terrible, and I wasn't going to give her anything if she didn't try any harder." "I do, it just wasn't really interesting." It was the easiest way to end the subject. "Well," she hesitated, as she shuffled through a stack of papers, "did you spend any time with your family?" "If you count living within the same walls, then yes." "Not really." "What can I say? I'm a kid." Not much to say to over-formal adults whose objective is to hunt and seek every flaw within my character. I strategically looked at the clock and made it apparent that I was doing so. We have an entire hour together, Derek. Let's talk about something. Wait, did she say an hour? Sure, she was a pain in the butt, but missing Mrs. Peterson's class for the next hour? I had better find a topic of conversation. It was growing silent, and the overdrawn pause in between her questions were making me uncomfortable. I like your eyes, Derek, she commented. It was rather spontaneous of her, unplanned and not scripted. There wasn't an extortion of emotion she was hoping to get out of me. She was really genuine in her compliment. It was common for people to comment on my eyes after they realized that the two were not alike. Do you have a favorite class yet, Derek? Stop saying my name, please. Doesn't make you any friendlier. Lunch, I said, and then she smiled at my response. It felt good to get a human reaction out of her, and I thought I'd try it a little more. That is not a subject, Miss Kendleton, or should I say Kathy, had assured me. Gym, I responded. Although I hadn't yet had my first gym class in middle school, I was eagerly looking forward to it, with Dylan being in my class and all. Do you like sports? A little. It is better than reading. Whoops. Not sure if I was supposed to say that. We threw conversation back and forth without it really leading anywhere. She'd propose a new subject, usually with the intention of trying to extort my interests, and I just as quickly shut it down with a well-placed killer statement. Or at least, that is what her textbook definitive mindset referred to it as. Derek, I would like to talk about the fight you got into a few weeks ago, she said, just after the two of us got a laugh out of our last topic of conversation. It wasn't unexpected, as I felt it coming from the start. She waited patiently for the right time to ask, and now that I was vocal and open to talk, she slammed the terrible subject right down on me. I didn't say anything. I tilted my head down and looked at the ground as I tried to deflect her intention to go there. I wasn't genuinely concerned about it, just I knew nothing fun would come of it. Can you explain to me what happened with you and Billy? She asked. Billy being the first time I had heard the name of the bully, though I knew his name from the start. He and his friends were pushing me in the lunchroom. Do you know why? 'Cause they are jerks, I put flatly. She began jotting down red pen notes into a small pad of paper that she had stealthily retrieved from under her desk. Would you like to talk it out with him? She asked, looking back up to me. God, no. I didn't say that, of course. Not really. It is important to use words to solve your problems, Derek, she asked, completely oblivious of the efforts I had put forth before clobbering the brutes. I tried. I nearly shuddered, rising from my seat as I was already stressed by the convictions I had to deal with before my suspension. They didn't listen, I said, returning to a calm state, trying to comfortably sit back down into the seat. Had you gotten into any fights in the past? No. This was your first? Yeah. More red scribbling. She folded her hands down onto her lap and took in a deep breath before she proposed her next question. I knew it long before she spoke it. How are things at home? They're okay. Irritation flaring in my mind. My dad doesn't hit me, my mom isn't alive anymore, and my sister can be mean only when I really get her mad. Well, that was a quick conclusion to the next 15 questions she was going to ask. Kathy's face remained blank for the next 10 seconds, and her mind was much of the same. Okay, she said, looking down into her notepad before writing a gigantic red question mark at its center. And I don't have any pets. Her head shot back up and she winced a strange look at me as I answered the next question she was thinking of. Alright. Well, that is alright. Kathy was writing straight words across her notepad in confusion, crossing them out just as quickly as she finished them. Have you spoken to a school psychiatrist before? She asked, assuming that I had, seeing as I predicted her questions. No. Derek, I would like to speak to you again. I think you and I could be friends, she spoke in her typical robotic state as she placed her notepad onto her desk. Okay, I answered, knowing it was really what she was looking for. Just tell me what time of the day you think would be best, and I would try to work it out for you. I'll get back to you on that, right when I figure out what the times are that I have Mrs. Peterson's class.